How's everyone doing today? This week we will be wrapping up the 3-week realist portrait painting demo that I've been working on for the past 3 episodes. Join me as we finish up this realist portrait painting, and I hope you enjoyed these clips from last week's footage. And if you haven't seen last week's video was the development of the color and form in relation to one another. And the week before that was the start of this painting. So we started off with our light and shadow shapes and whatnot. If you haven't seen the first episode or the second episode of this demonstration, I'll put a link in the description below for the start and the middle stages. But now let's move on to the final pass. For my colors, I've been using titanium white, so I have 3 dots of titanium white. I have, I believe, 2 dots of flake white replacement. From left to right, we have burnt umber, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, cadmium orange, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. Right now I'm mixing up a generic value scale of basic flesh tones. I do this pretty much every time I start to work in multiple values, but I do this more to have a gauge on my palette of my value scale and my colors in relation to one another. But I won't be using this directly at the moment. It's just going to be a reference for me to check out my values in relation to one another. I do this pretty much every time that I'm going to be working on a painting that already has a dry layer underneath. Now in this case, this painting has 2 layers underneath, so the values are going to be extremely important. Now the word finish in terms of art is a very loose term. It doesn't have a lot of clarity, and it probably shouldn't. It means that we're going to reach a point in the development of our painting that we have said what we wanted to say, or we're tired of trying to say what we wanted to say, and we set it aside. But in this case, with this painting, I wanted to execute multiple layers of rendering, and I wanted to show you all how I start a painting, work through the middle stages with color and value, and then finish. At the moment, I'm painting the values of the overalls, and I'm going to paint the overalls, and I'm going to paint the basic block-in of the shirt. Now, I don't want to completely finish this portion of the drapery. I just want to make sure that it holds in space and that it doesn't break away from the portrait too much. With a mixture of ultramarine blue, ivory black, white, and a little bit of burnt umber, I have a muted blue that is not terribly dark. And now I'm going to be mixing up the darks for the value of the shirt. Whenever working on clothing or any kind of drapery, it's important to, like the portrait, it's important to focus on the dark, the big shapes of light and dark. In this case, the shirt has a few folds on the collar and on the side of the arms. I'm going to make notes of these first. I'm going to place these darks first, and then I'm going to work in the light values. But I'm going to stand back periodically so that I can put the most informative marks on the canvas that will read as the shirt without getting too heavily focused on the details. When I'm mixing up the value for the light plane of the shirt, 2 things are going on in my mind. What is the color in relation to the face, and what is the value in relation to the face? Well, the color is a little bit warmer, more on the scarlet side, and the value relative to the face is lighter. The light is facing the shirt most, and so it's going to be a lighter value, but it's not going to be entirely white, and the scarlet color isn't going to be entirely scarlet. I'm not trying to mix up a pure pigment. I'm trying to mix up a color in relation to another color. As you can tell from the photo reference, it is lighter and it is a little more scarlet. But also take note that photo references are only second best to actually working from life. So I'm also not going to blast out the saturation of the shirt. The photograph was a little more saturated. The brush is completely loaded with paint, and I'm using the tone of the canvas to help me out here with the values. I'm putting some lighter planes of value and some darker ones by just scumbling the brush around to get a lighter value. And I'm doing this to get a more sketch-like look. As you can see, I just scrubbed in less paint on there, therefore the value was a little darker. It's more for an effect, it's more for an aesthetic reason at this point. I'm not a robot. I don't want to paint everything exactly to the book. The lightest regions of the shirt are breaking away from the more scarlet look to a more yellow, but I don't want it to be a straight up cadmium yellow either. So I'm mixing up some of the cadmium yellow, a little bit of alizarin crimson, some yellow ochre into the mix, but it's primarily white. I don't want it to be straight white because that rarely happens. I'm trying to make every brush mark count. I'm making every brush mark in the direction of the fold itself. It only takes a few of these marks to get the look of a fold on a shirt. Mixing up a little middle gray value that I'm going to use for the more intricate, tiny little details of the overalls. I don't want it to be too loose where it looks like the overall isn't strapped on. So I'm going to be, with a tiny brush and the little mixture I just made, putting some marks down for the connection of the overalls. And this isn't an exact science. This is not something that you need to focus all your efforts into. It's just a few marks to make these connections. And when you stand further back in space, you won't even know that it was just a few brush strokes. Now remember, the word finish is a loose term in art at best, but for me, to finish a painting doesn't mean render everything to the highest level of sophistication. Some areas I do want to render to the absolute highest level of sophistication that I can possibly do, like the eyes, the mouth, the nose, and whatnot. But other areas, like the collar or the buttons of the shirt, I like to leave a little more loose. I like having that variety in a painting where some areas are more highly finished and others are left in their earlier stages. Sort of like an old master painting when you can still see a bit of the underpainting showing through. Here's an example of that from one of my most favorite painters of all times, Nelson Shanks. After painting in the value of the shirt, I noticed that I had the neck a little bit too dark. So I'm going ahead and mixing up a little bit of a lighter color. I'm trying to keep the hue about the same, so the same color, but I'm trying to lighten in value a little bit on the neck. On the final pass of any painting, in a region of which I want to render the most, I have to focus on the edges. Behold one of my most favorite brushes that I've been using for the longest time. How beat up it is. But I can use it now as a scrubbing tool. A little secret to finishing a painting is once you've had all your large planes of value all said and done, and you want to push some edges further into each other, it's useful to have a dry, kind of stubby brush. Look at these regions over here. They're rendered, their planes are checked out relative to each other, but they just don't fit in with each other as completely as I would want them to. But what do I mean by fit in? What do I mean by these planes don't really fit into each other yet? I'll show you in the upcoming footage, but for now I need to mix up a more finely tuned value scale of flesh tones with carefully studied colors from the colors that I used in the previous video. Again, check out last week's video where I worked out the color and form. I'm mixing up this value scale with a lot of paint, ranging from light to dark, warm to cool, and then I will be mixing up another value scale underneath of it with much more grayed out neutral colors, so I can use it to neutralize the colors above it. And then after that's said and done, I'll mix up a little puddle of even cooler colors that I will use in case I want to cool down a color even more. I'm doing this so that I can mix some colors relatively close to the colors that I had on the dry layer, but mixing them in a way that uses very little paint, so I won't be mixing color too much. I will be taking directly from the palette as is to make the edges fit into one another. Once I have these value scales all said and done, I will be using them with a completely clean and dry brush, one brush for light, another brush for dark, and I will be picking at these colors to gauge the correct color and correct value of the planes that I had already established last week. And once I match those colors with each other, then I will be able to work out the edges in between them. Now this is just a little strategy to work out the edges. I won't be attempting to change any major color or value relationships because those were established in the previous layer. So what I'm doing is very small changes, very minute brush marks, and I'm checking out edges such as the edge of the eyebrow. It should be a little softer as it rolls away from the side of the eye socket. And I'm looking at the way that the values curve into the eyelid. It's a more dramatic change in curvature, therefore the change in the values as it rolls across to the inside of the eyelid should be more noticeable. I'm pretty much scumbling these values on. I'm using very little paint, and I'm doing this in a way that I can, if I mess up, like paint a little too much into the eye, I can just push it off like I just did. And the benefit is I don't have to change the large colors in relation to one another. No major changes. Here's my scrubbing brush. Now I can push the edges further and further till they're almost negligible. It helps in painting to work from general to specific, and in the beginning we're very general and at the end we're very specific. So at this point I'm getting very specific. I'm looking at the small shapes in relation to one another with the same level of accuracy that I had with the larger shapes. So I'm gauging their relative positions relative to the light. As you can see, I'm trying to push this value a little bit lighter on the cheek, but not too light, and I'm trying to match the value next to it as it rolls across towards the cheekbone. That edge is very, very subtle. How do we get subtle edges? We have to first mix the values as careful as we can, and then once we mix the values relatively close, then we can go back to our scrubbing brush. You don't have to use a scrubbing brush. If you have brushes that are very, very, very silky, you may be able to get away with it. But for me, it's just very helpful to keep a scrubbing brush to use in these final stages. For me, a scrubbing brush is kind of like the afterlife of a good brush. A good brush that you've used for many, many months, many, many paintings, has done its work in carving out planes, and then once it's finally used up, then you can still keep going with it as a little scrubber that helps push the tiny edges of the forms into one another. Remember, rendering is only one part of painting. Therefore, rendering is only a part of the finish. The finish doesn't mean that we've rendered everything to the same degree. And in this case, I'm still rendering a little bit. Notice that I'm using the scrubber now to push the edges a little closer into one another. Edges are really the final things you need to worry about when rendering form. First, when rendering form, you have to find where everything is. Once you've located it, then you have to carve out the large planes of value, and then you work out the colors in relation to one another. But in the end, it's pretty much all about the edges. Small little changes in the edges as they creep away from the light, and that will describe the entirety of the form. And if you haven't seen any of my videos on rendering form, I can also put a link in the description on rendering form. As you get more and more specific with the forms of the face, you really, really want to pay attention to the edges. Now I'm pushing this edge a little bit further now. I want this turn to be a little more evident. It really is a tiny, tiny, microscopic almost little section of value change that makes this look like a three-dimensional image. It's a tiny world of different shapes of value and color. Again, keeping this value scale on my palette is extremely useful. It saves me a lot of time in mixing up the values that I need. Throughout my painting experience, I've always wanted to push myself into making paintings that are not only beautiful but more believable in space, and it's really something that is all about the patience, and it's all about the understanding of the values in relation to one another, and then in the end, it's about the edges. I'm trying to work out the edge by painting in very little bits of dark value as it creeps from the side of the nose into the shadow of the eye, and then with the scrubber trying to make that edge just right so that it's almost minute. Look at this Nelson Shanks painting. It's beautiful in its own right, but look at the edges. Pay attention to the edges. That's what's describing the curvature of the form. Once you've established your large planes of color, Working out those edges in between them and getting them just right is what will make the magic happen. Look at this Nelson Shanks. For many, many, many years, it's been something I've been trying to figure out in my own paintings. How did he do it? How can I make my own paintings reach this level of sophistication? Notice what I did there with the black and white filter. So it's not the color that's making this magic happen. What is it? It's about the edges. Once you get the large planes of value, it's about the edges. This is how we do it. Working out this subtle passage in between the cheekbone into the mouth. These subtle passages are what will make the curvature of the form more readable in space and more three-dimensional. But some edges on the face are going to be sharper than others. For example, the edge between the bottom lip and the side of the mouth, I'm going in and reestablishing that edge with the intention of sharpening it. It is harder, it's a harder edge than the edges around it, and that's because there's a local value change from the local color of the lip, which is a little more on the reddish pink side than the local color of the flesh. I'm relying on my value scale on the palette to mix up the passageway between the bottom of the lip into the chin. This is a very, very subtle value shift. It's going to be lighter on the higher regions of the chin and a tad bit darker as it curves around. These changes in value are extremely subtle, and they require a little bit of spatial awareness. I'm aware that this region of the chin is facing the light more than the regions around it, but I know that the curvature isn't that intense, so I have to whittle away at it little by little and try to get these values to shift just right, and then use my scrubbing brush to sync them all together. Think about it as a jigsaw puzzle. You gotta figure out where the pieces go, and then you put the pieces together, and there you go, your puzzle is complete. But finishing the painting is like completing the jigsaw puzzle and then filling in the connections in between the puzzle pieces. In the earlier stage, we found the large planes of color and value in relation to one another. We broke down the bigger shapes into the smaller shapes, and now all we're doing today is erasing the seams in between the puzzle pieces. Here's a progression of progress images so you can see what I mean. Notice how much more smooth the bottom right, the finished one, is. So how did I get there? I pushed these edges further and further by softening some, hardening others, and in this case I'm softening this edge as the value gradates across the face closer to the ear. I'm taking great care at trying to match the colors that I had before, scumble them on lightly, and then manipulate the edge between the connections of the planes with my scrubbing brush. This is how I'm getting this effect of the curvature of the face. Though you're in the final stages of your realist portrait painting, you never really want to lose your sense of spontaneity. You really want to keep the painting as fresh as possible, even when rendering. And don't be afraid to make any kind of changes, as you can just wipe it off since you have a dry layer underneath. So I'm going to be painting a little more of the texture of the hair. I'm going to use more brush marks for that and keep it a little more expressive in contrast to the face. So I'm not afraid even at the final marks to make large brush marks. This is almost always the case for me when I'm painting from life or from photo references or whatever. I usually save the hair for last. Throughout the painting, you've seen me make some indications of the strands of the hair. I painted in the large values for the hair. But I really save the ending to paintings such as hair texture or whatever. And all it really takes is a soft brush, a soft synthetic brush, and a little bit of paint and some manipulation of the touch to get the effect of hair. Just a few marks. It's been a real journey for me trying to make these videos, these past 3 videos, because I've been focusing on the same painting. I've shown you all how I start and how I work the middle stages, and now I've just shown you how I finished. I've shown you most of what it took to make this painting. I hope that these videos are useful to you, and thanks again for watching this week's portrait painting demonstration, and stay tuned for my next episode, which will be next week. Thank you.